Hello, and welcome to the Idaho Alternate Assessment Accessibility Features training video for the Spring 2021 Test Administration. My name is Karen Striegel, and I am the Special Education Coordinator for Alternate Assessment, Low Incidence Disabilities, and Medicaid School-Based Services. After watching this training video, you will understand and be prepared to provide the accessibility features available to students taking the Idaho Alternate Assessment. I will begin by talking about the nature of the Idaho Alternate Assessment as an underlying factor for the allowable accessibility features. As you will see, several of the accessibility features available on the Idaho Alternate Assessment are different from those available on the ISAT. Some of the Idaho Alternate Assessment accessibility features are available as universal tools, while the same accessibility features are considered accommodations on the ISAT. I will cover the embedded and non-embedded accessibility features separately, then finish with the two Idaho Alternate Assessment accommodations. There is a separate training video dedicated to administering the Idaho Alternate Assessment. There are three main resources I will reference in this video. First is the 2020-2021 Online Summative Test Administration Manual, affectionately called the TAM. This year, we have combined the ISAT and Idaho Alternate Assessment TAMs into one TAM to rule them all. You can download the one TAM from the ISAT portal. Information about the Idaho Alternate Assessment accessibility features are covered on pages 14 through 17 of the TAM. It is important to understand that one purpose of this training video is to supplement the content contained in the TAM. However, it should not serve as a substitute for reading the TAM. You should read and be familiar with all the information in the TAM before administering the alternate assessment to any student. Now, I know the Idaho Alternate Assessment is separate from the ISATs, but the scribing protocol for the ISAT assessments and the guidelines for ReadAloud are relevant for administering the Idaho Alternate Assessment to students who need a scribe and/or need the test read aloud by a familiar adult. You can download both documents from the ISAT portal Accessibility and Accommodation Resources page. I will talk more about the scribe when I discuss non-embedded accessibility features, and I will talk more about read aloud by a familiar adult when I talk about accommodations. Here is a short video to show you where to find these documents on the ISAT portal. We will start on the ISAT portal homepage. But before I start clicking cards and hyperlinks, I want to show you where to find the paper materials order form, which I will reference when I talk about accommodations. It is the first teal colored card on the right-hand side of the ISAT portal homepage. You will find a link to the TAM on any of the test-specific pages: ELA Literacy and Math Assessments, Science Assessments, or Idaho Alternate Assessments. Since this is an Idaho Alternate Assessment training video, I'll click the Idaho Alternate Assessments card. From the Idaho Alternate Assessments landing page, look for the Test Administration Manual card. This opens the TAM in a new window. I advise against printing the TAM because it has several hyperlinks that will be useless from a paper copy. Now, back to the Idaho Alternate Assessment landing page so I can show you where to locate the scribing protocol for the ISAT assessments and guidelines for ReadAloud. Notice the teal colored bar at the top of the page. It reads Home, Get Started, Resources, FAQs, and Supported Browsers. This teal bar appears on the ISAT portal homepage and almost every other page on the ISAT portal. Hover over the Resources tab in the teal bar. You want to click Accessibility and Accommodations. Most of the documents on the Accessibility and Accommodations resource page are listed alphabetically, with the exception of the link to the non-standard accommodation request form and the Usability, Accessibility, and Accommodations Guidelines, which I like to call the UAG for short, and its companion documents developed by Smarter Balanced. These documents appear at the top of the list because they are most commonly used. Anyway, you will find the guidelines for ReadAloud listed with all of the other guidelines documents. Ta-ta-ta-ta! When you click the hyperlink, the document opens in a new window. Now, the scribing protocol for the ISAT assessments is at the bottom of the list. When you click the hyperlink, it opens the document in a new window. Now you know where to find the one TAM to rule them all, the scribing protocol for the ISAT assessments, and the guidelines for ReadAloud. If you don't already have the TAM, the scribing protocol, and the guidelines for ReadAloud on hand, I suggest you pause the video at this point to download them. I think it is important to consider the nature of the Idaho Alternate Assessment to understand why we have the accessibility features outlined in the TAM and explained in this video. The Idaho Alternate Assessment is constructed in a way that recognizes the traits intrinsic to students with the most significant cognitive disabilities. These students have pervasive needs that other students with disabilities do not have. The Idaho Alternate Assessment is designed to be administered to students in a one-on-one testing situation where the teacher, or TE, sits with the student and facilitates the test administration. Some students who qualify for the Idaho Alternate Assessment may need multiple test sessions over multiple days to complete the test, so a flexible test administration is assumed. It is important to note that some of the accommodations a student might use on the ISAT are considered universal tools on the Idaho Alternate Assessment and do not require IEP accommodations. However, there are two accessibility features that require IEP accommodations, which I will discuss later. Let's take a look at accessibility features that are embedded in the online Idaho Alternate Assessment that students will encounter in the Secure Test Browser. I suggest you open your TAM to page 15. All of the Idaho Alternate Assessment accessibility features listed on this slide are described in Table 6 of the TAM on pages 15 and 16. Most of them are standard accessibility features like color contrast, highlighter, print size, zoom, or volume control, so I will let you read the descriptions for yourself. I will only talk about two of them because one of them is new and the other one could be easily misinterpreted. Please take the time to visit the practice tests on the ISAT portal with your students so you are familiar with the embedded accessibility features before test day. Those of you who administered the Idaho Alternate Assessment in the past may remember the old Directions for Test Administration, affectionately called the DTAs. The DTAs included everything you needed to do and say to present test items to students. You could have had the computer read items to students, but it was a stilted computer voice that sounded a bit like the computer voice on the Starship Enterprise. Don't get me wrong, I love my Star Trek, but I would not want the Enterprise computer reading test items to one of my students with significant cognitive disabilities. So I am happy that we now have the lovely human voice recordings, which I will call HVRs from here on out. The HVRs are recordings of real people reading passages and stimuli, test items, and all response items. One thing I like about the HVRs is that they provide a standardized testing experience for all students across the state. You don't have to worry about mispronouncing odd names. You don't have to be concerned that you may read an item or the response options in a way that would give away the answer. You don't have to worry about describing images, tables, or charts. The HVRs are activated by clicking the ear icon, which is a little ear with a blue circle around it, as illustrated here on the screen. The HVRs can be activated by the student, the teacher, or the teacher can help the student. Let me caution you that all of the HVRs associated with an item must be played before a student chooses a response. This is especially important for the response options because oftentimes the graphic symbols that appear on the screen may not give sufficient information for a student to choose the correct response by themselves. In other words, the HVR supplements the graphic symbols shown in the response option. Let me show you what I mean. This test item comes from the Grade 3 ELA practice test. It goes with the passage and asks the student a comprehension question about the text. Why did they buy more milk? I know the graphic symbols are hard to see because they're so small. Sorry about that. Option A is the graphic symbol for breakfast. Option B is the graphic symbol for store. Option C is the graphic symbol for lunch. I will tell you that you would not be able to answer this question as it is, even if you had read the passage. When you play the human voice recordings, you can see that the graphic symbols support the answer options. Option A, Joey had finished the milk at breakfast. Option B, Joey liked to go to the store. Option C, Joey wanted to eat cereal for lunch. Option A is the correct response. Joey had finished the milk at breakfast. Without the HVR, any of the answer options may have appeared correct, and a student may have chosen an incorrect response even though they understood the story or otherwise knew the answer. So it is imperative that you or the student play all the HVRs associated with an item before the student chooses a response. I want to talk about print on demand so there are no misunderstandings about how it should be used. Print on demand should not be used to print every test item so you can administer a paper version of the test to a student. It is only intended for printing an occasional item if a student needs to see something on paper. You or a student can request that an item be printed by clicking Print Item in the Context or Hamburger menu as illustrated here. The print request goes to the test administrator or TA site. The TA or teacher approves the print request, then sends the item to the printer. It can take some time for the item to actually print. You can't print items ahead of time because you cannot skip items on the test. Each test item must be answered before going on to the next item. Please do not extend the amount of time it takes a student to take the Idaho Alternate Assessment by printing every item on demand. If a student needs to indicate their answer choice using printed materials, maybe through a picture exchange system, iGaze, or other augmentative or alternate communication system, please administer the Idaho Alternate Assessment fixed form with printed response option cards. I'll talk about this accommodated test form when I talk about accommodations. Now that you are an expert on the embedded accessibility features, let's take a look at the non-embedded accessibility features. Non-embedded means that the accessibility features are not accessed in the secure test browser. Take a moment to turn to page 16 of your TAM. All of these Idaho Alternate Assessment non-embedded accessibility features are described in Table 7 of the TAM on pages 16 and 17. I am not going to talk about assistive technology because this is the same accessibility feature students can use on the ISAT, and you can work with your test coordinator or technology specialist to help you manage pairing assistive technology with the computer for testing. I'll talk about the other three individually on the following slides. Augmentative and Alternative Communication Systems, or AAC systems, are covered in Appendix O of the TAM. Essentially, during testing, students should have access to whatever AAC system with which they are most competent and which provides them the most accessibility to indicate their response to test items. The AAC system a student uses during testing should be consistent with what they use during instruction. If you have administered any of the ISAT math assessments, you know that the Secure Test Browser has an embedded calculator that only appears when a student is allowed to use a calculator to answer that item. There are no calculator restrictions on the Idaho Alternate Assessment, so students may use a calculator on all math items whenever they need it. The online calculator is not intuitive, so students may use a familiar handheld calculator when taking the Idaho Alternate Assessment without the need for an IEP accommodation. The handheld calculator should have the same functions as the calculator embedded in the test. A student may use the handheld calculator to supplement their use of the embedded calculator or instead of the embedded calculator. Again, the handheld calculator is allowed for all Idaho Alternate Assessment math items. Some students who qualify for the Idaho Alternate Assessment regularly use math manipulatives like counters or other concrete materials to solve math problems instead of using a calculator. I am pleased to tell you that students may use familiar math manipulatives when taking the Idaho Alternate Assessment. We do not prescribe any specific types of manipulatives because different students use different materials in different schools. So, if a student regularly uses manipulatives to solve math problems, those manipulatives should be made available to the student during testing. A scribe is an allowable test accommodation on the ISAT and is usually used for the full write portion of the ELA literacy ISAT. However, teachers may serve as a scribe on the Idaho Alternate Assessment in a much broader sense, and the student does not need an IEP test accommodation to have a scribe. A scribe on the Idaho Alternate Assessment actually clicks the answer choice for the student in the Secure Test Browser. I already mentioned that either the teacher or the student can activate the HVRs. In some cases, the student may assist the student to play the HVRs. We know that some students who qualify for the Idaho Alternate Assessment cannot control a mouse because of fine motor or vision issues. We know that some students do not use a computer mouse with intention, meaning they randomly click around on the computer screen. We also know that some students will respond to test items using an alternate mode of communication to indicate their answer choice. Even though a student is not proficient with the mouse, they may point to, look at, or tell the teacher their answer. Maybe the student is using the printed response option cards with the Idaho Alternate Assessment fixed form version of the test. These are all reasons a student may need a scribe to click the answer in the Secure Test Browser. Regardless of how the student communicates their answer choice to the teacher, it is acceptable for the teacher to be a scribe and click answer choices for the student in the Secure Test Browser. The scribe just has to be sure they are clicking the student's answer choice, even if it is incorrect. Understand that a teacher serving as a scribe for a student taking the Idaho Alternate Assessment must comply with the scribing protocol for the ISAT assessments. I already showed you where to locate this document on the ISAT portal. We know that the Idaho Alternate Assessment is not the ISAT, but many of the guidelines described in this document are applicable to serving as a scribe on the Idaho Alternate Assessment. Be sure to coordinate with your test coordinator to be sure you are prepared to serve as a scribe for your students. Let's switch gears and talk about test accommodations for the Idaho Alternate Assessment. Remember, all the accessibility features I have discussed so far are considered universal supports and do not require IEP test accommodations for students to use them. As I said earlier, there are only 2 accessibility features that require IEP test accommodations. The first accommodation is read aloud by a familiar adult. I'll give you more details in a minute, but know that if a student needs a familiar adult to read the test aloud, then they must have a corresponding IEP test accommodation. The second test accommodation is called the Idaho Alternate Assessment Fixed Form with Printed Response Option Cards. It is quite different from your typical IEP test accommodation, so there are several ways you might document this test accommodation on a student's IEP. You might call it a paper test accommodation, an alternate response format test accommodation, or use other wording that fits this accommodated test form. You'll have a better idea of what you might call it after you learn exactly what it is in a few minutes. But first, I want to talk about the Read Aloud by Familiar Adult accommodation. If you administered the Idaho Alternate Assessment in ELA or math in the past, you may remember reading the entire test aloud to a student based on the DTAs. Now that we have the HVRs and a more standardized way to administer the Idaho Alternate Assessment, a student needs to have a Read Aloud IEP test accommodation to have the test read aloud by a familiar adult. For students with this IEP test accommodation, Read Aloud must be flagged in Tide. Teachers administering the test to a student with the Read Aloud by a familiar adult accommodation must follow all the processes and procedures outlined in the guidelines for Read Aloud that is posted on the ISAT portal. Teachers must follow the Idaho Alternate Assessment Test Administration script provided in Appendix L of the TAM as well. When providing the Read Aloud accommodation to a student, the teacher must first play the HVR, then read the text as modeled by the HVR. This includes restating any supplemental text associated with the response options. Remember the example I gave a little while ago where the response options showed graphic symbols but the HVRs were complete sentences? The teacher who reads the test aloud must restate the HVR for each response option exactly as stated in the recording. This holds true for any audio descriptions as well. Let me explain a little bit about the accommodated test form called the Idaho Alternate Assessment Fixed Form with Printed Response Option Cards. What a mouthful! This year, our new Idaho Alternate Assessments in ELA and Math are computer adaptive tests called CATs, meaning that item difficulty is based on how the student responded to the previous item. Each student taking a CAT will see different test items and have an individualized testing experience. As I mentioned earlier when I was talking about the Scribe accessibility feature, a student might point to or tell the teacher their answer, and the teacher may click the student's answer choice in the secure test browser. The fixed form with printed response option cards is intended for students who cannot indicate their answer choice as displayed on a computer screen. This test form is for students who cannot point to or tell the teacher their answer. It is for students who need to interact with printed cards to communicate their answer choice to the teacher. Maybe the student uses a picture exchange type communication system. Maybe the student uses an eye gaze frame to communicate. Or maybe the student uses some other communication system that requires printed options. Understand that this is a fixed form test, not a computer adaptive test, meaning that every student who takes the fixed form test in the same content area at the same grade level will take the same test with the same test items in the same order. The test is fixed. As I mentioned earlier, students who need this test form must have a corresponding IEP test accommodation. The teacher needs to communicate with the district or school test coordinator so the test coordinator can order the printed response option cards using the paper materials order form on the ISAT portal homepage. Remember, I showed it to you during the ISAT portal tour to find the TAM, the scribing protocol, and the guidelines for Read Aloud. The student must be coded as a paper tester in Tide so they get the test that corresponds with the printed response option cards. If the paper tester flag is not set to yes in Tide, then the student will get the CAT, and the printed response option cards will be useless. Be extra careful about the paper tester flag and tide, because the first 4 items of the CAT and the fixed form versions of the test are the same because of the early stopping rule. When administering the Idaho Alternate Assessment fixed form with printed response option cards, the teacher will follow the Idaho Alternate Assessment test administration script outlined in Appendix L of the TAM. The teacher will support the student to access test content in the secure test browser using the HVRs. The teacher will present the printed response option cards to the student while playing the HVRs for each response option. The student will indicate their answer choice using the cards presented by the teacher. The teacher will probably serve as a scribe for the student taking this test form by clicking the student's answer choice in the secure test browser. I know these are a lot of steps, but don't worry. I explain this process in more detail in the Administering the Idaho Alternate Assessment training video. This concludes the Idaho Alternate Assessment Accessibility Features training video. I know some of you will have questions, so I'll be hosting a couple of live virtual question and answer sessions in April. I will publish the dates and times in the assessment newsletter. Of course, you can call or email me with your questions as well. Thank you for taking the time to view this training video on the Idaho Alternate Assessment Accessibility Features. Don't hesitate to contact me when you need support.